The year is 1066, 273 years after the Vikings beached their longships on the island of Lindisfarne, and the medieval world changed forever. 754 years after Constantine saw a sign in the sky before the Milvian Bridge, and the Roman Empire began its long turn toward Christianity. 590 years after the last Roman emperor of the West took off his crown in the marsh palace of Ravenna. The Roman Empire is a memory now. The western half has been gone for 6 centuries. The eastern half, the empire Constantine built, the empire that still calls itself Rome, in the great city of Constantinople, is still there, diminished but alive, guarding the eastern edge of Christendom against the armies of Islam. But in the West, the Roman world has been replaced by something else entirely. A patchwork of kingdoms, a civilization held together not by legions and roads, but by the Latin of the Church, the authority of the Pope, and the feudal bonds between lords and vassals that have, over 5 centuries, woven themselves into the fabric of European life. England, in the year 1066, is one of the richest kingdoms in this post-Roman world. It has been united, more or less, for 150 years, since the grandsons of Alfred the Great brought the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a single crown. It has a functioning government. It has a treasury. It has a navy. It has, most importantly, a sophisticated system of local administration that allows its kings to raise taxes, muster armies, and enforce laws across an area of 50,000 square miles. It is, by the standards of the 11th century, a prize worth fighting for. And in the year 1066, 3 men are about to fight for it. One is an English earl, the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, who has just been crowned king. One is a Norman duke, who claims that the throne was promised to him by the dead king, and that the new king swore an oath to support his claim. One is a Norwegian king, a giant of a man, a veteran of wars from Byzantium to Scandinavia, who believes that the English throne belongs to him by an older, half-forgotten treaty. 3 armies, 3 claims, 1 crown. By the end of the year, 2 of these men will be dead. The third will be King of England, and England itself will be transformed. Its language, its laws, its ruling class, its architecture, its place in Europe, in ways that are still visible, still felt. The crisis began, as so many medieval crises did, with a dying king who had no children. Edward, King of England, was old. He was perhaps 62 years old in the winter of 1065, an extraordinary age for the time. He had been king for 23 years, since 1042, when the English lords had invited him back from exile in Normandy to take the throne of his ancestors. Edward was a strange king. He was pious, deeply, perhaps obsessively, devoted to the church. He had spent his youth in exile in the Norman court, while Danish kings ruled England. He had grown up speaking French. He had acquired, in those long years of exile, a preference for Norman customs, Norman advisors, Norman churchmen. When he returned to England as king, he brought Normans with him. He gave them estates. He appointed them to bishoprics. He built, in the last years of his reign, a great church in the Norman style, Westminster Abbey, which would become, in time, the coronation church of every English monarch from his day to ours. But Edward had not produced an heir. His wife, Edith, was the daughter of the most powerful family in England, the Godwinsons. She and Edward had been married for over 20 years. They had no children. The chroniclers hint delicately that the marriage was never consummated, that Edward, in his piety, had chosen celibacy even within marriage. Whether this is true or whether it is a later invention designed to make Edward look holier than he was, we do not know. What we do know is that by the winter of 1065, Edward was dying, and he had no son, no daughter, no direct heir of any kind. The question of who would succeed him had been hanging over England for years. It had shaped the politics of the kingdom. It had created alliances and enemies. It had drawn the attention of powerful men far beyond England's shores. Edward died on the 5th of January, 1066. He was buried the next day. The man who moved first was Harold Godwinson. Harold was, by 1066, the most powerful man in England after the king. He was the Earl of Wessex, the richest earldom in the kingdom, covering most of southern England. He was the brother of the Queen. He was the head of the Godwinson family, which had dominated English politics for a generation. His father, Godwin, had been the kingmaker of the previous reign. His brothers held earldoms across the country. His sister sat beside the king. Harold was, by all accounts, a capable and experienced leader. He was in his mid-40s. He had fought campaigns against the Welsh. He had negotiated with foreign powers. He had managed for years the delicate relationship between the English aristocracy and the Norman-influenced royal court. He was not of royal blood. The Godwinsons were nobles, not royals, but he had the support of the English lords, the English clergy, and the English people. On the 6th of January, 1066, the day after Edward's death, the day of Edward's funeral, the Witan met. The Witan was the council of the leading men of England, the earls, the bishops, the abbots, the most important thanes. It was, in modern terms, something between a parliament and a council of elders. It had the power to choose the next king. It did not have to choose the dead king's closest relative. It could choose whomever it judged to be the best man for the throne. The Witan chose Harold. He was crowned that same day in Westminster Abbey by the Archbishop of York. The speed of the coronation was deliberate. Harold and his supporters knew that there were other claimants. They knew that delay was dangerous. They wanted the crown on Harold's head before anyone could object. The crown was on his head. The kingdom was his. But across the English Channel, in a castle, William, Duke of Normandy, was 38 years old in 1066. He was, by any measure, one of the most formidable men in Europe. He had been duke since the age of 7 or 8, when his father, Duke Robert, had died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His childhood had been violent. Normandy in the 1030s and 1040s was a chaotic and dangerous place. 3 of William's guardians had been murdered. Assassins had entered his bedchamber on at least one occasion. He had survived by luck, by cunning, and by the loyalty of a small circle of supporters who had protected him through the worst years. By the time he was 20, William had fought and won a civil war against his own Norman barons. By the time he was 30, he had conquered the neighboring county of Maine and established himself as the most powerful lord in northern France. He was, the sources agree, physically imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, strong. He was also, by temperament, ruthless. He punished rebellion severely. He expected absolute loyalty. He rewarded his friends generously and destroyed his enemies without mercy. His claim to the English throne rested on two things. The first was blood. William was a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor. Edward's mother, Emma, had been a Norman, the daughter of a Duke of Normandy. William was, through a complicated line of descent, related to Edward on that Norman side. It was not a strong claim by the standards of the time. There were others with closer blood ties. But it was a claim. The second was an oath. According to the Norman accounts, and this is one of the most disputed facts in medieval history, Harold Godwinson had visited Normandy in the year 1064, 2 years before Edward's death. The purpose of the visit is unclear. The Normans said that Edward had sent Harold to confirm William's right to the English succession. The English said nothing of the kind. What the Normans claimed, however, was that during the visit, Harold had sworn an oath on holy relics, the most binding form of oath in the medieval world, to support William's claim to the English throne. Harold, the Normans said, had broken that oath when he accepted the crown for himself. This was, in the eyes of the medieval church, a serious matter. Oath-breaking was a sin. An oath sworn on relics was an oath sworn before God. To break such an oath was to invite divine punishment. William used the oath to brilliant political effect. He sent ambassadors to the Pope in Rome. He argued that Harold was a perjurer, a man who had broken a sacred oath, a man who had stolen a throne that rightfully belonged to William. The Pope, for his own political reasons, agreed. He sent William a papal banner, blessing the invasion. William could now present his attack on England not as a naked act of conquest, but as a divinely sanctioned mission to punish an oath-breaker and restore the rightful king. By the summer of 1066, William was building ships, hundreds of them, perhaps 700, perhaps 1,000. The forests of Normandy were being felled. The shipyards along the Norman coast were working day and night. An army was gathering, not just Normans but Bretons, Flemings, Frenchmen, adventurers from across northern Europe, drawn by the promise of English land and English gold. The invasion fleet assembled at the mouth of the River Dives in Normandy. It waited for a south wind to carry it across the channel. The wind did not come. For weeks the fleet sat. While William waited for the wind, a third claimant was already on the move. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was perhaps 50 years old in 1066. He was, by the standards of the age, a legend. He had spent his youth in exile after the death of his half-brother, King Olaf II of Norway, in battle. He had fled east across the Baltic, through the rivers of Russia to the great city of Constantinople, the richest city in the world, the capital of the surviving Eastern Roman Empire. There he had joined the Varangian Guard, the elite mercenary corps of Norse warriors who served the Byzantine emperor. He had fought in campaigns across the Mediterranean. He had, the sagas say, fought in 18 major battles before he returned to Scandinavia. He had accumulated in those years a vast personal fortune. He had returned to Norway in the late 1040s, had made himself king, and had spent the next 20 years consolidating his power, fighting wars against Denmark and dreaming of conquering England. His claim to the English throne was thin, based on an old treaty between a previous Norwegian king and a previous English king decades earlier, which had arguably given each the right to inherit the other's throne if one died without an heir. It was a dubious claim, legally, but Harald Hardrada did not, in truth, care much about legal niceties. He was a warrior. He wanted England. He intended to take it by force. He had an ally. Harold Godwinson's own brother, Tostig, had rebelled against Harold the previous year. Tostig had been the Earl of Northumbria, the great northern earldom, until the Northumbrians had risen against him, accusing him of cruelty and misgovernment. Harold, forced to choose between his brother and the stability of the kingdom, had sided with the Northumbrians. Tostig had been stripped of his earldom and sent into exile. Tostig was, by all accounts, furious. He wanted revenge. He wanted his earldom back, and he was willing to ally with anyone, even a Norwegian invader, to get it. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada sailed from Norway with a fleet of perhaps 300 ships and an army of perhaps 9,000 men. Tostig joined him with his own smaller force. Together they sailed up the Humber estuary into the heart of northern England. On the 20th of September, at a place called Fulford, just south of York, the Norwegian army met a hastily assembled English force under the northern earls Edwin and Morcar. The English were defeated. York surrendered. The north of England lay open. Harold Godwinson in London received the news. He had been waiting all summer for William's invasion from the south. He had posted his army along the southern coast. He had kept his fleet at sea. He had watched the channel for Norman sails. Now, suddenly, the threat was from the north. Harold acted with extraordinary speed. He turned his army around. He marched north, 200 miles, from London to Yorkshire in less than 5 days. It was one of the fastest forced marches in medieval military history. On the morning of the 25th of September, 1066, Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York, where the Norwegian army was camped. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was short and brutal. Harold's army crossed the river and attacked the Norwegian camp. The fighting was fierce. Harald Hardrada, the great warrior, the veteran of 18 battles, the man who had fought from Constantinople to Scandinavia, was killed early in the battle. An arrow struck him in the throat. He fell. His men, leaderless, fought on for a time. Tostig took command. Tostig too was killed. By the end of the day, the Norwegian army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had crossed the North Sea, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The rest of the ships sat empty in the harbor, their crews dead on the field. Harold had won a stunning victory. He had eliminated one of the 3 claimants to the English throne. He had saved the north of England. He had proven himself beyond any doubt to be a capable military commander. He had also exhausted his army. The men who had marched 200 miles in 5 days and then fought a pitched battle against a Viking army were tired. They were wounded. They had lost comrades. They needed rest. They would not get it. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, on the 28th of September, 1066, the wind changed in the English Channel. William's fleet, which had been waiting for weeks at the mouth of the Dives, caught the south wind at last. 700 ships, perhaps more, set sail across the channel. They crossed in a single night. At dawn on the 29th of September, the Norman army landed on the beach at Pevensey, on the southern coast of England. There was no one to oppose them. Harold's army was 200 miles to the north, still resting after Stamford Bridge. The southern coast, which Harold had guarded all summer, was undefended. William landed. He built a wooden castle at Hastings, a motte and bailey, a mound of earth topped with a wooden palisade, a quick and effective fortification. He sent his men out to raid the surrounding countryside. He burned farms. He seized livestock. He made it clear to anyone watching that he intended to stay. The news reached Harold in York on or about the 2nd of October. Harold once again turned south. Once again he marched his army at extraordinary speed, 200 miles, in perhaps 10 or 11 days. He gathered reinforcements as he went. He called on the southern lords to bring their men. He sent messengers ahead to London, ordering the city's garrison to be ready. By the 13th of October, Harold was approaching Hastings with perhaps 7,000 men. Many of them were exhausted. Many were new recruits, half-trained peasants who had answered the king's call but had never fought in a serious battle. Harold had mobilized, the historians estimate, barely half of England's trained soldiers. The rest were still marching south, or had not yet received the summons, or were too far away to arrive in time. Harold could have waited. He could have let William sit at Hastings, consuming his supplies, while the English army grew stronger. On the evening of the 13th of October, Harold's army arrived at a place called Senlac Ridge, a low hill, perhaps 7 miles northwest of Hastings, at the edge of a great forest. The ridge was a good defensive position. It was steep enough to slow an attacking army. It was narrow enough that Harold's smaller force could hold the full width of the ridgeline without being outflanked. The forest behind offered an escape route if things went badly. Harold deployed his army along the top of the ridge. His men formed a shield wall, the classic Anglo-Saxon defensive formation. The shield wall was exactly what it sounds like. A line of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their large round shields overlapping, forming a continuous barrier of wood and iron. Behind the first rank stood more men with spears and axes, ready to step forward when the man in front of them fell. The shield wall was, when properly formed and properly held, almost impossible to break by frontal assault. It had been the foundation of Anglo-Saxon warfare for centuries. Harold's best troops, his housecarls, the professional warriors who served as his personal guard, carried the great Danish two-handed axe, a weapon that could split a horse's skull with a single blow. These men were placed in the center of the line, where the fighting would be heaviest. Harold's plan was simple. Hold the ridge. Let the Normans attack uphill. Let the shield wall absorb the attacks. Wait for William to exhaust his army, and then, if the opportunity came, counterattack. It was a sound plan. It nearly worked. William, in his camp at Hastings, learned of Harold's arrival that evening. He decided, as he had decided before every battle in his life, to attack immediately. He would not wait. He would not negotiate. He would not give Harold time to strengthen his position or receive reinforcements. At dawn on the 14th of October, 1066, William marshaled his army and marched northwest towards Senlac Ridge. His army was organized in 3 divisions. On the left, the Bretons. In the center, the Normans. On the right, the Flemish and the French. Each division had 3 elements: archers in the front, infantry behind them, and heavy cavalry, knights on horseback, armed with lances and swords, in the rear. William himself rode with the Norman center. He wore a consecrated reliquary around his neck, a container holding the very relics on which Harold had supposedly sworn his oath 2 years earlier. He carried in his hands the papal banner that the Pope had sent him. He was, in his own mind, God's instrument. The battle he was about to fight was not just a military engagement. It was a trial by combat, on a national scale, with God as the judge. The morning was cold. The sky was clear. The 2 armies could see each other across the valley. The Battle of Hastings was about to begin. Is call, but had never fought in a serious battle. Harold had mobilized, the historians estimate, barely half of England's trained soldiers. The rest were still marching south, or had not yet received the summons, or were too far away to arrive in time. Harold could have waited. He could have let William sit at Hastings, consuming his supplies, while the English army grew. The battle began around 9 o'clock in the morning. William's archers advanced first. They moved to within bowshot of the English line, perhaps 150 yards, and loosed their arrows uphill toward the shield wall. The arrows had little effect. The English shields caught most of them. The angle was bad. Shooting uphill, the archers had to aim high, and many arrows sailed over the English line entirely. The English, who had relatively few archers of their own, could not return fire effectively. The opening exchange was, for both sides, inconclusive. William then sent his infantry forward. The foot soldiers, men with swords, spears, and short axes, climbed the hill toward the shield wall. They reached the English line. The fighting became close, fierce, and bloody. The English housecarls, with their great 2-handed axes, cut down the Norman infantry as they reached the top of the slope. The shield wall held. The Norman infantry, unable to break through, fell back. William then committed his cavalry. This was the decisive arm of the Norman army. The Norman knights were, by the standards of the 11th century, the most effective heavy cavalry in Europe. They rode large war horses, bred for strength and endurance. They carried long, kite-shaped shields. They wore heavy chainmail. They fought with couched lances, a relatively new technique in which the lance was held tightly under the arm so that the full weight and momentum of the horse and rider was concentrated in the point of the weapon. The cavalry charged uphill. The shield wall held. The horses, struggling on the slope, could not build enough momentum to break through the wall of shields and axes. The English housecarls pulled riders from their horses. They hamstrung the animals. They hacked at the legs of the horses and the legs of the men. The cavalry, bloodied, fell back. The first phase of the battle was over. Harold's plan was working. The shield wall was intact. The Normans had failed to break it. William's army had taken heavy casualties. On the Norman left, the Breton division broke. The Bretons, perhaps the weakest of William's 3 divisions, had been repulsed by the English right. They had charged uphill, had been thrown back, had charged again, had been thrown back again. On their third retreat, something snapped. The retreat became a rout. The Breton cavalry and infantry turned and fled down the hill, away from the English line, in open panic. A rumor swept through the Norman army. William was dead. The Duke had fallen. The battle was lost. For a few terrible minutes, the Norman center and right wavered. If William was dead, the invasion was over. There was no one else to lead the army. There was no one else the Norman lords would follow. William was not dead. He had been unhorsed. His horse had been killed under him, but he was alive. He pulled off his helmet so that his men could see his face. He rode through the ranks on a fresh horse, shouting, rallying, striking men with the flat of his sword to turn them back toward the fight. The Norman sources say he grabbed a spear and held it high, shouting, "Look at me, I am alive, and with God's help, I will conquer." The panic subsided. The Normans reformed. The battle resumed. But something else had happened in those chaotic minutes, and it would prove decisive. When the Bretons had fled, a portion of the English right wing had broken ranks to pursue them. The English soldiers, perhaps the less disciplined, feared the part-time militia rather than the professional housecarls, had charged down the hill after the retreating Bretons, abandoning the shield wall, breaking the formation that was their greatest advantage. They had been cut off. The Norman cavalry, reforming after the panic, had wheeled around and attacked the pursuing English from the flanks. The English, now in the open, without the protection of the shield wall, were slaughtered. William noticed. He noticed that the English, when they thought the enemy was retreating, could not resist the temptation to pursue. He noticed that when they pursued, they left the shield wall, and that outside the shield wall, the feigned retreat was a risky tactic. It required extraordinary discipline from the cavalry. The horsemen had to ride toward the English line, engage briefly, then turn and flee, convincingly enough to draw the English out, and then, at a prearranged signal, wheel around and attack the pursuers. If the feigned retreat became a real retreat, if the cavalry panicked, if the signal was missed, if the English were not fooled, the result could be catastrophic. The retreating cavalry, disordered and confused, could be cut down by the pursuing English. But William was a gambler. He had gambled his entire duchy on this invasion. He had crossed the Channel with an army, knowing that if he lost, there was no retreat. His ships could not carry his army back to Normandy in the face of an English fleet. He had staked everything on a single battle. He was not, at this point, going to play it safe. The Norman cavalry executed the feigned retreat. They charged the English line. They fought briefly. Then they turned and fled, down the hill, in apparent disorder. The English once again pursued. They came down off the ridge, out of the shield wall, into the open ground. The Norman cavalry wheeled. They turned. They charged the scattered English from all sides. The English who had left the ridge were killed. William repeated the tactic, again and again. Each time, a few more English soldiers were drawn out of the shield wall. Each time, the Norman cavalry cut them down. The shield wall, which had started the morning as a continuous barrier across the ridgeline, was growing thinner. Gaps were appearing. The English line was slowly being whittled away. The battle had been going on for hours. It was now afternoon. Both armies were exhausted. The field between the ridge and the Norman lines was carpeted with dead and dying men, dead horses, broken weapons, shattered shields. The noise, the screaming of wounded men, the crash of weapons, the shrieking of horses, had been continuous since 9 o'clock in the morning. Harold's army was still on the ridge. The shield wall, though thinner, was still holding. Harold himself was still alive, still in the center of his line, still fighting. William needed to break through before dark. If night fell and the English still held the ridge, the battle would be, at best, a draw. And a draw, for William, was a defeat. He could not sustain a siege. He could not survive a winter campaign. He needed to win today, or not at all. He ordered a final combined assault. Archers, infantry, and cavalry would attack together. The archers would shoot high, over the shield wall, to force the English to raise their shields against the falling arrows. The infantry would engage the shield wall from the front, and the cavalry, at the same time, would charge the gaps that the arrows and the infantry had created. What happened in the final hour of the Battle of Hastings is the most famous image in English medieval history. The Norman archers in the final assault changed their angle of fire. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they arched their arrows high into the sky, so that the arrows fell from above, over the top of the shields, onto the heads of the men behind. The English, who had been holding their shields forward against the infantry and cavalry, were now forced to raise them overhead as well. The shield wall began to come apart. Gaps opened, men fell, and somewhere in those last minutes, at the center of the English line, an arrow fell from the sky and struck King Harold. The exact nature of Harold's death has been debated for nearly 1,000 years. The most famous version comes from the Bayeux Tapestry, the great embroidered cloth, 70 meters long, made perhaps 10 years after the battle, that tells the story of the Norman conquest in pictures. In one of the tapestry's most famous panels, a figure labeled Harold Rex, King Harold, is shown standing beneath the words Harold Rex interfectus est, King Harold is killed. The figure appears to be pulling an arrow from his eye. This image, Harold with the arrow in his eye, has become one of the most iconic images in English history. It has been reproduced in 1,000 textbooks, 1,000 paintings, 1,000 popular histories. It is, for most English people, the single image they associate with the year 1066. But scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. Some argue that the figure pulling the arrow is not Harold at all, that Harold is the figure next to him, who is being struck down by a Norman horseman with a sword. Some argue that both figures are Harold, showing 2 stages of his death, first the arrow, then the sword. Some argue that the tapestry has been altered over the centuries, and that the original image may have looked very different. What we know from the written sources is that Harold died in the final phase of the battle. He may have been struck by an arrow. He may have been cut down by a group of Norman knights. He may have suffered both fates, first wounded by the arrow, then killed by the horseman who reached him. The sources agree on one thing. When Harold fell, the English army collapsed. The housecarls, the professional warriors, the men who had fought beside Harold for years, the men who had sworn oaths to defend him to the death, fought on for a time around his body. They were killed almost to a man. The Fyrd, the part-time militia, the farmers and tradesmen who had answered the king's call, broke and ran. They fled into the forest behind the ridge, into the gathering darkness. The Normans pursued them. Some of the English made a last stand in the forest, in a place later called the Malfosse, the evil ditch, where pursuing Norman cavalry tumbled into a concealed ravine and were killed by English fugitives. But it was a footnote. The battle was over. The day had lasted from 9 in the morning until dusk, perhaps 8 or 9 hours of continuous fighting. It was one of the longest battles of the medieval period. When the fighting ended and the field was quiet, and the autumn darkness had settled over the ridge, the Normans lit their torches and began to search for the English king. They found his body among the housecarls, near the spot where the English standard had stood. He had been so badly mutilated that he could not, at first, be identified. His face was destroyed. His armor had been stripped. The Normans brought a woman, Edith Swanwick, Harold's common-law wife, who had lived with him for 20 years. William did not march immediately on London. He was cautious. His army was battered. He had won the battle, but he had not yet won the kingdom. The English lords might rally behind another candidate, Edgar Atheling, a great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, a boy of perhaps 14, who had the strongest hereditary claim to the throne. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, were still alive, still in command of their forces. The city of London was walled, defended, and hostile. William moved slowly. He marched east along the coast to the port of Dover, which surrendered without a fight. He moved to Canterbury. He fell ill, perhaps dysentery, perhaps exhaustion, and rested for several weeks. Then he moved toward London, approaching the city not from the south, where the defenses were strongest, but from the west and north, in a great sweeping arc that took him across the Thames at Wallingford and then down through Hertfordshire. He burned villages as he went. He destroyed crops. He made it clear that resistance would be punished. The strategy was deliberate. William was not trying to conquer England by force alone. He was trying to terrify the English into submission. It worked. The English lords, one by one, submitted. Edgar Atheling, the boy with the strongest claim, was brought to William at Berkhamsted by a delegation of English nobles and bishops. He surrendered his claim. The city of London opened its gates. On the 25th of December, 1066, Christmas Day, William, Duke of Normandy, was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was performed by Ealdred, Archbishop of York, the same churchman who had crowned Harold 11 months earlier in the same building. The congregation, composed of both Normans and English, shouted their approval when asked if they accepted William as king. The shout was so loud that the Norman guards posted outside the abbey, misinterpreting the noise as a riot, panicked and began setting fire to the neighboring buildings. Smoke filled the church. The congregation fled. William, the sources say, was left almost alone at the altar, trembling, whether from fear or from the cold or from the sheer strangeness of the moment, we cannot know. He was king. England was his. The Anglo-Saxon age, 600 years of England. The transformation that followed was vast. William, over the next 20 years, systematically replaced the entire ruling class of England. The Anglo-Saxon earls, thanes, and bishops who had governed the country for centuries were removed, killed, exiled, or stripped of their lands, and replaced with Normans. By the time of William's death in 1087, virtually every major landholder in England was Norman or French. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was gone. The language changed. English, the language of Beowulf, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of the laws of Alfred the Great, ceased to be the language of government, of law, of literature. It was replaced in official documents by Latin and in daily court life by Norman French. English survived as the language of the common people, the farmers, the laborers, the servants, but it would not return as a language of high culture for nearly 300 years. When it did return, in the 14th century, it was a different language, profoundly shaped by the French vocabulary that the Normans had brought with it. This is why modern English has two words for almost everything. The Anglo-Saxon farmer raised a cow, a sheep, a pig. The Norman lord at his table ate beef, mutton, pork. The Anglo-Saxon words survived for the living animals. The French words replaced them for the cooked meat. The Anglo-Saxon said house. The Norman said mansion. The Anglo-Saxon said wish. The Norman said desire. The Anglo-Saxon said freedom. The Norman said liberty. The entire vocabulary of modern English, its strange richness, its doubled words, its capacity for nuance, is a product of the Norman conquest. The architecture changed. The Normans were great builders. They built, within a generation of the conquest, the Tower of London, the great cathedral at Durham, the castle at Windsor, and dozens of other stone fortifications and churches across the country. The English landscape, which had been a landscape of wooden halls and small stone churches, became, within a few decades, a landscape of massive stone castles and enormous Romanesque cathedrals. Many of these buildings survive. The White Tower at the center of the Tower of London was begun by William in 1078. It is still there. The law changed. William introduced gradually the Norman feudal system, a rigid hierarchy of lords and vassals, of fiefs and obligations that replaced the looser Anglo-Saxon arrangements. He commissioned in 1086 the Domesday Book, an extraordinary survey of every piece of land in England, every manor, every farm, every cow, every pig. It was the most detailed census of a country's wealth ever attempted in medieval Europe. It was, in its thoroughness, a statement of ownership. William was saying, in effect, I own all of this. I know what you have. I will tax you for it. The church changed. Norman bishops replaced Anglo-Saxon bishops. Norman abbots replaced Anglo-Saxon abbots. The great monastic houses of England were reorganized along Norman lines. Canterbury Cathedral was rebuilt. The story of the Norman conquest survives in vivid detail because of a single extraordinary object. The Bayeux Tapestry is not, despite its name, a tapestry at all. It is an embroidery, a long strip of linen cloth, about 70 meters long and 50 centimeters wide, onto which the story of the conquest has been stitched, in colored wool, by skilled English needleworkers. It was probably made within 10 or 15 years of the battle, perhaps commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, who played a prominent role in the invasion and who appears frequently in the embroidery itself. The tapestry tells the story of the conquest from the Norman point of view. It begins with Harold's visit to Normandy in 1064 and his oath to William. It continues through Edward's death, Harold's coronation, William's preparations, the Channel crossing, and the battle itself. It ends, or rather, it breaks off, because the final section has been lost, with the English fleeing the battlefield. It is, in its way, one of the most remarkable historical documents in the world. It shows us what 11th century ships looked like, how 11th century men dressed, what weapons they carried, how they cooked their food, how they built their castles. It shows us the faces of the men who fought, or at least the faces the embroiderers imagined for them. It shows us Harold pulling the arrow from his eye. It shows us William rallying his men. It shows us the horses, the shields, the banners, the dead. It is, in the most literal sense, a medieval movie, a visual narrative, frame by frame, of the events of 1066. It was designed, almost certainly, to be displayed in a great hall, unrolled along the walls, so that viewers could walk alongside it and follow the story from beginning to end. It was, in its time, a work of propaganda, designed to justify the conquest, to tell the Norman version of events, to present William as the rightful king and Harold as the oath-breaking usurper. But it is also a work of art. The colors are still vivid, reds, greens, blues, yellows, golds, after nearly 1,000 years. The figures are lively and expressive. The horses charge, the arrows fly, the ships sail, the men die, tumbling from their horses, clutching their wounds, falling beneath the hooves. The tapestry survives today in a dedicated museum in the city of Bayeux, in Normandy, France. You can walk its full length in a darkened gallery, following the story as it unfolds. It takes perhaps 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. In those 20 minutes, the story of the Norman conquest survives in vivid detail because of a single extraordinary object. The Bayeux Tapestry is not, despite its name, a tapestry at all. It is an embroidery, a long strip of linen cloth, about 70 meters long and 50 centimeters wide, onto which the story of the conquest has been stitched, in colored wool, by skilled English needleworkers. It was probably made within 10 or 15 years of the battle, perhaps commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, who played a prominent role in the invasion and who appears frequently in the embroidery itself. The tapestry tells the story of the conquest from the Norman point of view. It begins with Harold's visit to Normandy in 1064 and his oath to William. It continues through Edward's death, Harold's coronation, William's preparations, the Channel crossing, and the battle itself. It ends, or rather, it breaks off, because the final section has been lost, with the English fleeing the battlefield. It is, in its way, one of the most remarkable historical documents in the world. It shows us what 11th century ships looked like, how 11th century men dressed, what weapons they carried, how they cooked their food, how they built their castles. It shows us the faces of the men who fought, or at least the faces the embroiderers imagined for them. It shows us Harold pulling the arrow from his eye. It shows us William rallying his men. It shows us the horses, the shields, the banners, the dead. It is, in the most literal sense, a medieval movie, a visual narrative, frame by frame, of the events of 1066. It was designed, almost certainly, to be displayed in a great hall, unrolled along the walls, so that viewers could walk alongside it and follow the story from beginning to end. It was, in its time, a work of propaganda, designed to justify the conquest, to tell the Norman version of events, to present William as the rightful king and Harold as the oath-breaking usurper. But it is also a work of art. The colors are still vivid, reds, greens, blues, yellows, golds, after nearly 1,000 years. The figures are lively and expressive. The horses charge, the arrows fly, the ships sail, the men die, tumbling from their horses, clutching their wounds, falling beneath the hooves. The tapestry survives today in a dedicated museum in the city of Bayeux, in Normandy, France. You can walk its full length in a darkened gallery, following the story as it unfolds. It takes perhaps 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. In those 20 minutes, it is late now. Close your eyes. Let Harold rest, the last Anglo-Saxon king, who fought 2 battles in 3 weeks and lost the second one by the width of an arrow. His body was buried, the early sources say, on the cliff top at Hastings, overlooking the sea he had tried to defend. Later traditions moved his grave to Waltham Abbey in Essex, the church he had founded and loved. Where he truly lies, no one knows. The ground has kept that secret for nearly 1,000 years. Let William rest, the conqueror, who gambled everything on a single crossing and a single battle and won. He would rule England for 21 years. He would die in 1087 in Normandy from injuries sustained when his horse stumbled on the burning ruins of a French town he had just destroyed. His funeral, by all accounts, was a disaster. His body, bloated from the injury, would not fit in the stone coffin, and when the attendants forced it in, the corpse burst, filling the church with a terrible smell. The mourners fled. Even in death the conqueror was not gentle. Let Harold Hardrada rest, the last of the great Viking warriors, with the arrow in his throat on the field at Stamford Bridge. His dream of an English kingdom died with him on a September morning, and the Viking age, which had begun 273 years earlier on the sands of Lindisfarne, ended there, in a field in Yorkshire, 3 weeks before Hastings. Let Tostig rest, Harold's brother, who betrayed his own family for an earldom and died for it, far from home, in the company of a foreign king. Let all of them, the housecarls who died around their king, the Norman knights who charged uphill into the shield wall, the English farmers who marched 200 miles and fought 2 battles and were buried in a field they had never seen before. Let all of them